this video, I'll be covering the Vietnam War. I will cover the Indochina War, their divisional compositions, tactics, Soviet and Chinese aid, and their trap. After World War II, the world was reshaping itself, and in Southeast Asia, a storm was brewing. Vietnam had just endured years of brutal Japanese occupation, but when the war ended, the French tried to reassert control over their old colony. The Vietnamese people, however, had tasted independence, and they weren't about to go back. Ho Chi Minh's forces, the Viet Minh, were a coalition of communist and nationalist fighters that resisted French control. What followed was the First Indochina War, a bloody 8-year conflict between French colonial forces and the Viet Minh. Backed by popular support, the Viet Minh waged a determined guerrilla campaign. The people became their very resistance. And in 1954, everything had changed. At Dien Bien Phu, Viet Minh forces surrounded and defeated the French in a historic and decisive battle. The defeat forced France to the negotiating table. This was huge for them. The Geneva Accords were signed, and Vietnam was now split into two countries, a communist north and a US-backed anti-communist south. It was supposed to be a division to keep the peace in the region, but instead it had set the stage for a coming war, which was the Vietnam War, which was way more devastating. During the Vietnam War, one of the most formidable forces wasn't just a regular army. It was the Viet Cong, a guerrilla group that fought using unconventional tactics. I will break down the key strategies that made them so effective against powerful foreign forces. Let's start with ambushes. The Viet Cong were masters of surprise. They would set deadly traps and wait in silence, striking enemy units when they least expected it. This chaos gave them the upper hand. Before the enemy could even react, it was often already over. Next up is sabotage. The Viet Cong targeted vital infrastructure like roads, bridges, and communication lines, but by cutting off supply routes and scrambling logistics, they didn't just damage equipment, they undermined entire operations, weakening the enemy's ability to sustain military campaigns. Hit-and-run attacks were a hallmark of Viet Cong warfare. Quick strikes followed by fast retreats meant that they avoided long battles, and the goal was to cause damage, confuse the enemy, then vanish, leaving their opponents swinging in shadows. The Viet Cong also used terrorism as a weapon. Behind enemy lines, the operatives carried out bombings, assassinations, and other missions. These acts weren't just about damage. They were designed to spread fear, shake morale, and disrupt daily life for both civilians and military forces. Then there's psychological warfare. The Viet Cong were unpredictable and cautious, making their presence a constant mental pressure by targeting religious sites, government buildings, and even farms. They aimed to demoralize both soldiers and civilians alike.
Unlike conventional armies, the Viet Cong operated in small units. Why, you may ask? Smaller groups meant faster movement, better stealth, and the ability to strike where the enemy was weakest. These units could disappear just as quickly as they appeared. Perfect Viet Cong guerrilla tactics.
Finally, the terrain itself was a weapon. The Viet Cong knew their lands inside and out. From dense jungles to hidden tunnels, they built hideouts in areas nearly impossible for outsiders to navigate. This home field advantage allowed them to launch attacks and then melt back into the environment. The Viet Cong tactics weren't just about firepower, they're about strategy, speed, and survival. These guerrilla methods helped them fight against much larger and better equipped armies, and they changed the course of history. The North Vietnamese Army, or the NVA, was more than just a hit-and-run fighting group. They were a highly organised and formidable force. I'll break down how they were structured and why they were so effective. Most North Vietnamese Army divisions consisted around 10,000 soldiers. These divisions were highly organised to maintain efficiency and communication, even in the chaos of jungle warfare. A typical division was made up of 3 infantry regiments, and each regiment contained 3 battalions. These battalions then had multiple companies, each responsible for executing specific battlefield roles while maintaining clear command structures. Artillery support was also part of the North Vietnamese arsenal. Most divisions had artillery units equipped with mainly mortars, and while heavy artillery wasn't common, during important operations larger weapons like howitzers could make an appearance, backed by meticulous coordination. What made the North Vietnamese Army especially formidable was their support network. Every division was backed by dedicated signal companies for communication, engineer units for building and demolition tasks, and logistics teams to ensure a steady supply of food, ammunition, and medical aid. The Vietnam War wasn't just a conflict between North and South Vietnam, it was also a stage for Cold War rivalries, where global superpowers picked sides. I'll be diving into the role of Soviet and Chinese military assistance to North Vietnam. Let's start with the Soviet Union. Their support was focused on technology and air defense. They supplied the North Vietnamese with surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, modern aircraft, and military advisors. This wasn't just about helping a fellow communist nation, though. It was about showing the world who the true leader of the communist bloc was, especially with the United States backing South Vietnam. China's support was even more intermediate and large-scale. After the US launched airstrikes on North Vietnam, China quickly sent 36 fighter jets, followed by 8 more in April. They also provided huge quantities of small arms ammunition, material aid, food, and supplies. With a shared border, Chinese support flowed easily and rapidly across into North Vietnam. Beyond weapons and gear, both Soviet and Chinese forces sent military advisors to train the North Vietnamese army. These advisors helped the North Vietnamese to develop tactics to counter Australian and American strategies and technology, making them way more prepared and more dangerous. This assistance wasn't just charity, it was strategic. For both the USSR and China, Vietnam was a proxy battlefield to challenge US influence. Supporting the North allowed them to flex their global power, gain influence in Southeast Asia, and compete with each other for leadership in the communist world. Our final topic is their traps. In Vietnam, the enemy was not always visible. The jungle itself became their weapon. Viet Cong fighters laid traps not only to kill, but to demoralize, terrify, and to send a message. No place was safe. In the early war, Viet Cong forces placed bow traps throughout towns and forests. Simple tripwires triggered sharpened bamboo arrows, fired with deadly force, capable of instantly killing or leaving a soldier critically wounded. Some traps used nature as the executioner. Snake pits, often filled with venomous species. They were hidden beneath foliage or placed in an abandoned weapon cache. Opening the wrong box could mean a lethal bite in a remote jungle far from medical help. Among the most feared were the punji stick traps. They were bamboo spikes driven into hidden pits. They were often coated in human waste or natural toxins, not only to wound, but to cause life-threatening infections that could claim limbs or even lives days later. The bamboo whip was another brutal design. A sharpened pole drawn back and tensioned. It was released by a tripwire to strike with the force of a spear, silent, sudden, and fatal. What was heavier was the swinging mace, a 20-kilogram weight, sometimes metal, sometimes clay, suspended from a tree. One misstep and it would swing violently into a soldier's torso, crushing ribs and breaking spines. The tiger trap operated from above. A wooden plank embedded with metal spikes would fall from a canopy, impaling the upper body. It was designed not just to kill, but to cripple survivors for life. Partridge traps were crude yet devastating. A single bullet placed in bamboo, triggered by a nail, that acted as a makeshift landmine. Even a glancing step could result in amputation, permanent disability, or death. Even in retreat, Viet Cong forces turned abandoned bases and flags into weapons. They rigged trophies and gear hidden with explosives, designed to kill anyone who reached for them to gain a war trophy. That is the conclusion to my video about the Vietnam War. I hope you've enjoyed.